Hey all, special edition video here. Late breaking news. Thought I'd make a few comments on chapter 1 from our text, American Government 3E. Just got done putting together the study guide, and a few concepts jumped out at me where I was like, oh yeah, I should probably address those pretty directly to kind of help you navigate that material. Number 1. Make sure you take note of the mention in that text, chapter 1, of Adam Smith, legendary Enlightenment figure, Scottish, his magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations, right, in which he argues for a free market economy on a global scale. So, and what was he arguing against, right? He was arguing against tariffs. He was arguing against tariffs. Something back then would have been part of a system called mercantilism. And as we'll see, as we get to talking about in Chapter 2, Module 2, the American Revolution, right? This is one of the reasons for the Revolution, right? That Great Britain had mercantilist policies towards the American colonies that became increasingly unacceptable to us. Right, because they were trying to benefit themselves at our expense. Mercantilism, tariffs, among other things. Again, mercantilism is the broader system. Tariff is one way to that fits within the mercantilist category. Right, and it turns out we'll see Great Britain restricted our ability to produce finished goods and restricted our ability to conduct trade with other nations. Right, they said, no, we get a monopoly on access to your natural resources. We'll turn them into finished goods, and then we'll sell them back to you and globally. Mercantilism with a vengeance. Not tariffs per se, but certainly mercantilism. We're like, that's unacceptable. So that's what Adam Smith was talking about. Which leads me into my next point, right? So Adam Smith, a strong advocate for a relatively free market economy. I always say relative, right? Because as things evolved over hundreds of years, as we increasingly engaged in sort of connecting democracy with relatively free markets, or capitalism, that democracies demanded, right, regulations on that economy, right? Things like anti-monopoly statutes, things like child labor laws, workplace safety laws, perhaps minimum wage laws, on and on. Right? So relatively free markets. And so, right, combining a relatively free market economy with our democratic system of governance. Our authors point out very nicely, right, that don't conflate democracy and free markets. Those are not the same things. Democracy is a political system. Free markets are an economic system. Not the same thing. They're often seen together, like here in the United States and elsewhere, right? But not always. All right. So, and in many ways, right, democracy and free markets go together super well because, right, the alternative, it turns out, to free markets is socialism, where government owns the means of production. There are others who have a loose or incoherent or very broad definition of socialism. That's mostly just bullshit, quite honestly. I'm going to go here with Friedrich Hayek's definition. Socialism is when government owns the means of production, right? Owns the energy companies, owns social media, owns the newspapers, owns the retail sector, owns the health sector, right? That's socialism. That's the alternative to a relatively free market economy. Socialism, right, given that it involves government owning the means of production, it puts too much power in the hands of the government, right, where government has both political power but also economic power. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Generally speaking, socialism, understood in that way, is not conducive to being joined up with democracy. Typically, in today's world, we see socialism joined up with authoritarian regimes in places like China and Russia and North Korea. All right. So generally, you do see capitalism or free markets and democracy, sort of combining. But they're not the same thing. They are different. But they do often go together. And they go together quite nicely, right? Because a relatively free market economy, right, it decentralizes economic power to largely private actors, entities, corporations, businesses, individuals. Right? So government doesn't have all of that economic power. Government clearly has some economic power, but a lot of it, right, is in private hands. So that decentralizes power, right? And decentralized power is part and parcel of what it means to be a democracy. The government does not have a monopoly on power. It is not overly powerful. It is powerful, but not overly powerful. So they do often go together, and there's a reason for that. Now, I would say, right, that as our authors note, a free market economy isn't always fully compatible with democracy. Right? Free market economies tend to produce a lot of inequality economically, especially these days, where you have this handful of billionaires and then the rest of us, pretty much. Quite a gap in between, right? That is a product of a free market economy. And that kind of inequality, right, economic inequality, leads to social and political inequality that harms democracy. So I'm not saying democracy and free markets go together perfectly. They don't, but they go together pretty well. Better than democracy and socialism. So that's what the point I think our authors are trying to make there. I should also say, right, that in terms of a free market economy, what democracies require of that, two things. One I've already mentioned, right, regulations on the economy. Reasonable regulations, but also, right, a welfare state. Also a welfare state, which we've had here in America, right, since the 1930s. But that's not socialism. That's my point there. That's not socialism. Read Friedrich Hayek's, what's the name of his magnum opus that I love so much? A Constitution of Liberty. A welfare state is not socialism. It's not. It's not. It's a welfare state. Yeah. All right. So I wanted to say that. Yeah, a lot of good stuff here. Check it out in the study guide. Review that material extra in our text, especially as we point towards exam 1. We talked about some of this stuff. This is all good. Yeah. All right. So that's mostly what I wanted to talk about. All right. Thanks.